Okay, so let's just do stealing just to hammer this home. Now, Kant doesn't himself do stealing, but I think it's important to do it and see how this expands. So suppose that you need to do something innocuous like printer paper, right? Suppose you're at work, you need printer paper. They have 3 reams of it sitting there, stacks of paper. You think to yourself, I'm going to take one. Well, is that immoral? Yes, Kant thinks. Why? Well, again, categorical imperative shows us. First, you formulate the maxim. Well, what are you doing? So if someone came up to you and said, hey, what are you doing? You say, well, I'm taking this paper. And they say, what do you mean? Well, they have extra paper, and I need it, so I'm taking it. And then the person would say, okay, so basically then you think it's okay to take something that isn't yours when you need it. Well, you would have to say yes, because that's what you're doing. So we take that rule that you are following right now. When I need something, I take it even if it's not mine. And you universalize it. What if everyone did that? Now remember, we're not here thinking, well, they do it if they want to or certain occasions, but they must do it, right? We're universalizing the maxim, which means we're asking, what would the world be like if everyone had to do this? Well, we can imagine the world where there would be a bunch of people, there would be stuff, and you could get some stuff, but you couldn't really say that the stuff was yours because someone would come and take it from you if they wanted it, if they needed it, and then you would have to try to stop them if you could, but if you couldn't, then it was just theirs. Now, is there a contradiction in this world? Well, Kant thinks that there is a contradiction in this world, and that should be obvious because remember, what he's doing here is trying to show us that the categorical imperative grounds our moral duty. So I haven't said that up until this point, but it's an important point to make. Kant doesn't think that he's trying to prove something which you don't know already. So it's not as though he's trying to prove to you that you should tell the truth or that stealing is wrong or that you should keep your promises. In fact, Kant thinks that the average person already believes all this stuff. The average person already knows that they should tell the truth and keep their promises and help others and so on. But of course, Kant thinks the average person doesn't know why it's morally right to do that. And the average person doesn't know what to say in response to the challenge from the egoist and the relativist who say that either it's not really right to tell the truth, it just depends on how you feel about it or what your culture says, or the egoist who says, well, it's only right to tell the truth because it benefits you somehow. The average person doesn't know how to respond to that, but they feel beset upon, Kant thinks. So the categorical imperative and this whole argument about reason and rationality and contradiction is just supposed to be able to give a response. When somebody says, well, you think you should tell the truth all the time, but why think that? Well, here's an answer that's a little bit more technical, and the average person isn't usually interested in doing it, but it's sort of the equivalent of a person who wanted to know, well, you know, if you say all men are mortal and you say Socrates is a man, why should you believe Socrates is immortal? The average person does, but they often don't have the training in logic which allows them to give an argument for that conclusion. So that's what Kant's doing here. He's just trying to vindicate or justify our everyday ordinary beliefs about morality, which he takes to be of the absolutist variety. Right? He doesn't think the average person is a relativist. He says it over and over again. The average person is an absolutist. They think that these things are absolutely true. The person on the street believes that it's right to tell the truth and to keep your promises and to help others. And what Kant is just trying to do is show that they're right and that the relativist is wrong. And why. Now, I don't know if that's right or not, but that's what Kant thinks he's doing. And so that's kind of interesting. So when he's going through this then, saying, you know, how is stealing contradictory and is it right or wrong to steal, we already know the answers in some sense. Of course the answer is no, it's not right to steal. So what Kant's trying to do is show, well, look, the categorical imperative actually captures why it's wrong to steal. And it allows us to sort of, when we reflect on it, to see that the categorical imperative is the right moral law. It's the one which commands our respect. Okay, so that's a bit of a bracket here, but an important point nonetheless. Back to the story then. Is there a contradiction here? Well, of course, we know Kant thinks there is a contradiction. What is it? Well, We've already said that. In this world, people are just simply taking whatever they need when they need it. So if I need to get to work and I need to drive a car there, I simply take whatever car's around, I steal it, right? I break into the car, hotwire it, drive off. Someone else needs the car, they take it later. If someone steals that car, I take a different car. So if I need some food, I just grab some. I break into your house, I take the food. I break into this place, I take the food. So whatever is around, and if I need it, I just take it. What's contradictory about that? Well, notice Kant thinks that in this world that we're describing, there would be no such thing as ownership. Now, why not? Because to own something is more than just possessing it. For instance, I own a car. Now, if I loan you my car, I give you the keys and you drive it around, you do not own my car, even though you possess my car. Why not? What do I have that you don't have? Well, what I have is I have a legal right to the car. I have the deed, I have the title. It's registered under my name, not yours. So I have a right to the car. Now, what does it mean to have a right to the car? Well, Kant says to have a right is to be able to make a claim and to have somebody back it up. So if you took my car from me, since I own it, I can complain to the police and we can prosecute you. But in the world we're imagining, there is no ownership. Right? There is no ownership. There's merely possession until somebody else comes and takes it from you. But of course, the problem here is that when you steal something, you try to own it. You try to make it yours. But of course, in the world that we're imagining, there is no ownership. So again, the very thing you're trying to do can't be done. It's contradictory. Now, why think that a person who steals something tries to own it? Well, think about this commonsensically. This happens all the time. For instance, your friend has a really nice sweatshirt that you really like. Your friend lets you borrow it. You wear it out one night, the hoodie, something like that. You really, really love this sweatshirt. Now, suppose that you just lie to your friend and say that it was lost, and you keep it because you love it so much, right? So you say, "I'm gonna steal this sweatshirt." Now, suppose you have this sweatshirt for a while, and then one of your other friends sees it. "Oh, isn't that so-and-so sweatshirt? Oh, yeah, I know. I told them it was lost. Ha, ha, ha. Ah, interesting," they say. "Can I try it on?" Sure, they try it on, and then you say, "Can I have it back?" They say no. You say, "What? Give me that. It's my sweatshirt." Now, what's the right response that this person is going to make? Usually, they say things like this. "It's not yours. You stole it." Well, what's the joke here? The joke is that it's right. If you just take something, that doesn't make it yours. So in this world we're imagining where everyone's just taking anything they need, that doesn't mean that they own it. But they think that it's theirs, and they often feel neglected or wronged when someone takes something from them. But in this world, no one can own something. So the very act of stealing embodies this contradiction, namely that you're trying to gain some right to this thing which you have no right to, or you're trying to own something in a world where nothing can be owned. So, stealing is always wrong under all circumstances, Kant thinks. There are never any circumstances under which stealing is morally acceptable. Even in the counterintuitive kinds of cases that you might think, yes, even in the cases where you're starving to death and you want to steal a piece of bread, Kant says it's always wrong to steal. It's never morally right to steal. So, very different than the kind of view that Aristotle had, where he said, look, it depends on what the virtuous person actually decides is right in the circumstances. And so when we're trying to figure out what's morally right and what's morally wrong, we have to think about what virtuous people would do in these situations. What does the good person do? And Kant is here saying, no, that's not what you do, because you can say, the good person might say, well, in this case, right, you can imagine, would Mother Teresa steal something to feed a starving child? Yeah, probably she would. But Kant's here saying, no, that's immoral. It's irrational, because it embodies this contradiction. So a very different kind of view that Kant has. So we've been talking only about perfect duties so far, the ones that entail contradictions, according to Kant, when you try to maximize, when you try to universalize these maxims. So now what we're going to do is start talking about the imperfect duties. And the imperfect duties, remember, are imperfect because we don't get technical contradictions when we imagine these scenarios. So take, for instance, the example of helping others when you have the ability to help them. Now that's important. Kant doesn't think that you just have the duty to help others all the time, but only when you're in the position to help them. So if you happen to have an extra $100 and someone really needs that money, but you would rather spend it on a night out with your wife or something like that, well, Kant thinks that you have a duty to help this person because you're able to help them. So now if you don't have any extra money, you literally can't even afford your own rent, then you don't have a duty to give this person money. Because you can't afford to give this person money. So you only have the duty to help other people when you're able to help them. But why does he think this? Well, suppose you see someone on the subway being mugged. Now, suppose you're able to help them. You could call 911. There's a police officer being distracted at the other end of the car, or you're a large enough person, physically trained in the martial sciences, that you could step in relatively confidently. Now, of course, you can't guarantee that you won't be hurt, but let's say that, because sometimes fulfilling your duties may entail that you risk your life, even get harmed. So you can't simply say, well, I might get hurt and therefore I am not going to help this person. So if you're able to help the person, suppose you choose not to. Suppose you're a black belt and you just think, I don't want to get involved, I might get hurt. Or suppose there's a policeman there and you think, I don't want to get involved, I might have to testify, and then in my neighborhood that's bad or something like that. So what do? Well, you formulate the maxim. The general maxim here is, when I'm in a position to help other people, I won't, for whatever reason. Now, what would the world look like if this were a universal moral law? Would there be a contradiction? Well, it would be a cold and calculating world, but there's no contradiction there. We can certainly imagine a world where nobody helps anyone else. Certainly seems possible. It's not a great world. It's not a fantastic world. It's sort of a world full of Scrooge McDucks, but it's something that we can certainly imagine. No contradiction. But could you really want the world to be that way? Now, this is what I was talking about previously, that it's a different kind of contradiction that's at work here. So Kant thinks that the problem here is that we recognize that in that world where nobody helped anyone, that would be a world where nobody helped you. But of course, Kant thinks, being rational as we are, we recognize that we need help. We need other people to help us reach our goals. There will be times when we need to accomplish some goal, and where we will be unable to do that on our own, and we will therefore have to depend on the help of others. Now, what do you do with someone who disagrees with that? Says, I'll never need help. Well, Kant just thinks that's irrational. It's demonstrably false that one person isn't able to achieve all of their goals all on their own. They need help at some point. So if that's the case, if it's really the case that if you think about it, you recognize that there's going to be at least one time where you're going to need somebody else's help in order to reach some goal of yours, well then, you can't rationally or consistently will that the world be such that no one helps anyone. Because then you're basically determining that the world should be such that you don't achieve your views, which you can't want. You can't want the world to be such that your goals aren't going to be achieved. You want your goals to be achieved, and that's important. So there's a contradiction in will here. You can't really want the world to be this way, Kant thinks. And so therefore you have an imperfect duty to help others, because you can't, even though you can consistently imagine the world being this way, you can't really want it this way. Okay, so here's another Here's another one of Kant's examples. So the example of suicide, a bit more controversial than some of these other examples. Kant thinks that we have a duty to preserve our lives, and that suicide is immoral. And interestingly, he gives an argument from the categorical imperative aimed to show this. Now again, he took this that the common person thought that suicide was immoral. And part of the reason for this is that Kant was a Christian, and it's a traditional part of Christian morality that suicide is immoral. Commonly put in such ways as that it's not up to us to decide when we die, but that's up to God. So suicide is strictly ruled out on a lot of religious views. And Christianity is not the only one. So now we're asked to consider a person who wants to commit suicide because their life is just too unbearable for them to continue living. What does the categorical imperative tell us about this? We know, as we were just discussing, what various religious views tell us about this. Muslims as well as Christians agree suicide is immoral. At least now they do. It hasn't always been the case. In medieval times, suicide was considered a virtue in some instances, and in some cultures, suicide is still an acceptable practice. For instance, in some cultures, if one is dishonored, it's appropriate to take one's own life or something like that. So what does the categorical imperative tell us about this? Well, we take the maxim, which is just that whenever a person is fed up with living, they kill themselves. So it's for self-love that you're doing this, because your life is just too unbearable. So in order to end all this agony and in order to end the suffering that you have, you're going to end it all. So really, you can say that it's the thing that's doing the work here is that you want to avoid all this suffering, which is that. So Kant that is putting it by self-love. Now, universalize that maxim. What if everyone did this whenever life was unbearable? They just killed themselves. So now again, remember, he's not interested in the consequences of this. So he's not going to, for instance, argue, oh, well, then the human species would die off, bad consequences. That's not what he's concerned with here. So it's something different, the contradiction business. Is there a contradiction here? Well, Kant thinks, yeah, there is a contradiction here. Namely, in the reason that you act for self-love. So self-love here, then, is the reason that we normally use to justify preserving our life. So think about this for an instance. Why do we want to avoid pain? What is the purpose of pain? Now, clearly pain is not fun. We don't like pain. But does pain serve a purpose? Well, clearly pain does seem to serve a purpose. It alerts us, for instance, that something is wrong. So if you break your ankle, it hurts. Your body's telling you there's a problem here. Attend to it. Now, of course, the pain also modifies your behavior so that you don't aggravate or worsen the injury. So if you break your ankle again, it hurts, alerts you to it, you start attending to it. And then when you try to walk on it, it hurts more. So you can't just continue walking on it. That, of course, would aggravate the injury. And so pain's very useful to us. The painfulness of it is very useful to us. It motivates us highly to avoid certain circumstances, to attend and pay attention to certain stimuli. Now, of course, it can be overridden. The body's very smart. If a bear's coming, you may want to run on that broken ankle, and so we can override that pain. But in the normal circumstances, it's very useful in alerting us to things we need to avoid or attend to. Now, notice, though, that the reason that we want to avoid the pain, the reason why we seek to avoid pain, is because that's good for us. It preserves our life ultimately in the long run. That's what's going on. So the normal purpose of self-love is life preservation. But here, in the suicide case, the thing which normally preserves our life is being used to end our life. And that's a contradiction in the purpose of the thing in question. So this is very interesting because this represents what's perhaps Aristotelian or natural law theory-like thinking in Kant's view. So the Aristotelians, remember, Aristotle argued that everything has a purpose. Its function, its entelechy, even human beings. And he gave his whole argument about that in terms of functions. And in the Middle Ages, this idea becomes very popular. And people think, well, all the stuff around us has functions. And it's wrong to use something in a way contrary to its function, because it was made for a certain purpose, and so to use it in another way is wrong. So if the purpose of pain is to preserve our life, it's wrong to use it to end our life. So here then there's a way of thinking, well, Kant is connecting up, drawing out a theme from earlier views and showing how the categorical imperative really embodies what is right about it. Now, another way of, well, let me just hold off on a second on that. So here what he thinks he's demonstrated is that it's always wrong to commit suicide. It's never morally permissible to commit suicide. And you can use this exact same kind of argument to condemn any kind of sexual activity that is not explicitly for procreation. And Kant does very explicitly condemn masturbation and sex for pleasure. And in the modern times, people like the Pope have even condemned the use of condoms, even if the consequences are detrimental. Like, for instance, in Africa, the result has been the spread of HIV. The Pope says it's still wrong to use a condom because the purpose of sex is procreation. The purpose of sex is not pleasure. It's made for a purpose, namely procreation, bringing other life into the world. So these people like Kant and the natural law theorists think it's wrong to contradict that purpose. Now, what's interesting about this is that this is a different kind of contradiction than either of the other two kinds that we've met so far. So the bit about lying and stealing and murdering and so on is a formal technical contradiction, namely of this kind: the very thing that you're trying to do can't be done. The second kind of contradiction that we encountered was not that the very thing that you're trying to do can't be done, but rather it can be done, but it contradicts a basic human desire, a basic thing that if you reflect on the human condition, you see, aha, this contradicts that. That's a contradiction in will, as Kant put it, as the helping other people